The Galactic Confederation Military Academy floated majestically in the neutral space between three spiral arms of the Milky Way. Its gleaming hexagonal structures rotated in perfect synchronization, creating artificial gravity that was precisely calibrated for optimal training conditions. The Academy represented the pinnacle of galactic military education, a place where the brightest young minds from 17 sentient species came to learn the art of warfare from 17 sentient species, came to learn the art of warfare from the most advanced civilization in the known universe. Or so they thought. Commander Drezek Trelock stood at the massive viewport in his office, 4 of his 6 appendages clasped behind his back in the traditional posture of contemplative authority. His exoskeleton gleamed with the polish appropriate for his rank, and the neural transmitters protruding from his skull pulsed with the cool blue light of controlled thought processes. "Professor Veelan, you are precisely 3 standard units late," Trelock announced without turning, his mandibles clicking with mild irritation. "My apologies, Commander." Professor Neri Veelan glided into the office, her gelatinous form shimmering with iridescent colors that betrayed her excitement despite her attempt at professional composure. "I was reviewing the final materials for my proposed lecture series and lost track of time." Trelock rotated one eye stalk toward her while keeping the other fixed on the starscape. "Ah yes, your controversial proposal." "Controversial, yes, but educational." Veelan's form pulsed with bright yellow, her species equivalent of an enthusiastic grin. "I've dedicated my career to studying primitive species, Commander, and none are more fascinating than the bipedal mammals of Sol 3. "Humans," Trelock said the word like it was mildly distasteful. "A species that has barely managed interplanetary travel within their own system. They're hardly worth academic study, let alone inclusion in our military curriculum." Professor Veelan flowed over to the commander's desk, her colors shifting to a serious blue. "That's precisely the misconception I hope to correct. The Galactic Intelligence Corps has been monitoring their communications for centuries. They may be technologically inferior, but their approach to conflict is unique." "Unique?" Trelock finally turned fully, his exoskeleton clicking as he moved. "They still use combustion weapons and physical projectiles. Their combat vehicles roll on the ground. Their most elite warriors engage in close-quarters combat with bladed implements. It's primitive." "Primitive, yes," Veelan conceded, "but oddly effective. And more importantly, resilient in ways our cadets should understand." Commander Trelock's mandibles twitched in what passed for a skeptical expression among his species. The Academy had a reputation to maintain. They produced the galaxy's most sophisticated military minds officers who orchestrated battles using quantum entanglement, psychological warfare algorithms, and gravitic manipulation. The idea of studying humans, a species still obsessed with pointing metal tubes at each other, seemed absurd. Yet Veelan was the foremost xenologist in the Confederation, and her assessment of potentially threatening species had proven valuable in the past. Her analysis of the methane-breathing Gorgons had prevented a diplomatic incident that could have led to interstellar war. "Very well," Trelock finally said. "You may proceed with your lecture series. But I expect it to reinforce our cadets' understanding of the Confederation's technological and tactical superiority. The last thing we need is to glamorize primitive warfare methods." Professor Veelan's form rippled with satisfaction. "Of course, Commander. This is purely educational. I believe our cadets will find it illuminating." As she glided out of the office, her colors shifted briefly to a deep violet that Trelock couldn't interpret. Had he been more familiar with Veelan's species, he might have recognized it as the color of someone keeping a delicious secret. The faculty lounge buzzed with gossip as Professor Veelan finalized her presentation materials. The crystalline data storage unit hummed as it processed terabytes of intercepted human communications, war documentaries, and military training videos. "Is it true?" Professor Mendox's insectoid form leaned over Veelan's workstation, his compound eyes reflecting the scrolling data. "You're showing actual human combat footage to the senior cadets?" "Indeed," Veelan replied, her form pulsing with professional pride. "The Intelligence Corps has remarkable archives. Everything from their world wars to modern insurgent conflicts. But they're so messy. Mendox's antennae twitched with distaste. Humans leak fluids when damaged. They scream. They display emotional responses during combat. It's unseemly. Veelan's colors darkened slightly. That's precisely the point. Our cadets need to understand that not all species approach warfare with our clinical detachment. Some fight with passion, with desperation. Sometimes that makes them dangerous in ways our simulations don't account for. Across the academy, the senior class was abuzz with rumors about the special lecture. In the cadet quarters, 4 of the academy's top students debated the upcoming presentation. Humans? Cadet Rixel snorted, her feline features contorting with disdain. My genetic ancestors hunted creatures like them for sport. Why waste our time studying walking prey? Because the Confederation protocol demands we understand all potential adversaries, replied Cadet Lorvik, his crystalline body structure catching the light as he meticulously arranged his study materials, even the primitive ones. Cadet Marine, whose gaseous form was contained in a specialized suit, bubbled with laughter. I heard their primary combat strategy involves standing in lines and shooting at each other. No wonder they haven't made it past their moon. Don't be so quick to judge, said Cadet Fendrax, the quiet neural collective, who rarely spoke but whose countless small components were always observing, always analyzing. Professor Veelan doesn't waste our time on trivialities. The next morning, Commander Trelock stood at the entrance of the Academy's Tactical Analysis Theater, greeting arriving faculty members with crisp nods. When Professor Veelan arrived, surrounded by hovering data modules, he pulled her aside. I've reviewed your presentation materials, he said quietly. Some of this footage seems excessively violent. Are you certain this is appropriate for our cadets? Veelan's form rippled with confidence. They're training to be military officers, Commander. If they can't handle watching combat, how will they handle directing it? There's a difference between tactical combat simulations and this. Trelock gestured to a floating image showing human soldiers engaged in trench warfare. It's barbaric. It's reality, Veelan countered. A reality our cadets should understand before they're faced with it in the field. Reluctantly, Trelock stepped aside, allowing Veelan to enter the theater. The chamber was impressive, a hemispheric room with adaptive seating for all Confederation species and holographic projection capabilities that could recreate battle scenarios in 3 dimensions with perfect fidelity. As the cadets filed in, their excitement was palpable. This was something different, not the usual simulations of space battles or planetary defense strategies. This was a glimpse into a species many had only heard about in passing, a primitive curiosity from a backwater solar system. Little did they know how profoundly this lecture would change their understanding of warfare and their career paths forever. Welcome, cadets, Professor Veelan's form pulsed with professional colors as she addressed the filled auditorium. Today we begin our analysis of Sol 3 combat methodologies, or as the natives call their planet, Earth. I must warn you that what you're about to see may challenge your preconceptions about warfare. The lights dimmed, and the holographic projector hummed to life. A 3-dimensional recreation of a human battlefield materialized in the center of the room. Observe their primitive combustion weapons, Veelan narrated as images of human soldiers carrying rifles appeared. They call this an assault rifle. A chemical propellant launches metal projectiles at supersonic speeds. Several cadets snickered. Cadet Rixel raised her paw. Professor, my species abandoned such weapons 8 millennia ago. What possible tactical advantage could these provide? A fair question, Veelan acknowledged. Let's observe them in action. The hologram shifted to actual footage from a human conflict. The sounds of gunfire filled the theater, sharp, chaotic cracks that made several cadets flinch. The footage showed soldiers advancing through urban ruins, diving for cover as bullets struck nearby surfaces. Notice how they continue fighting despite environmental hazards, Veelan pointed out. Dust, extreme temperatures, water immersion, their weapons continue functioning. Crude but admittedly resilient, muttered Commander Trelock, who had taken a seat at the back of the theater. Now let's move to more complex engagements, Veelan continued. The hologram shifted to footage of intense house-to-house fighting. Human soldiers kicked in doors, tossed in explosive devices, then rushed in shooting at close range. The violence was intimate, desperate, and utterly unlike the clinical precision of Confederation combat simulations. The theater had grown noticeably quieter. The snickering had stopped. "Their species lacks natural armor," Veelan explained. "A single projectile can cause catastrophic damage to their internal organs. Yet observe their willingness to expose themselves to danger to achieve objectives." The footage continued, showing increasingly intense combat scenarios. Cadet Marine's containment suit bubbled with agitation. "Professor, why don't they retreat when sustaining casualties? It's illogical." "An excellent observation," Veelan replied. "Humans have a concept they call leaving no one behind. They will often risk additional casualties to recover their wounded, or even their dead." "That's tactically unsound," stated Cadet Lorvik, though his crystalline structure had developed tiny fracture lines, a sign of stress in his species. "Perhaps by our standards," Veelan conceded. "But it serves important psychological and morale functions in their military structure." The hologram shifted again, this time showing footage from historical human conflicts. The massive formations of soldiers charging across open fields despite devastating artillery fire. Troops wading through chest-deep water under enemy fire to reach beachheads. Surrounded soldiers fighting to the last round rather than surrendering. "This behavior pattern repeats throughout their military history," Veelan explained. "They call it courage under fire or fighting spirit. It's a cultural value that transcends tactical logic." The theater had gone completely silent. Even Commander Trelox was leaning forward, his mandibles perfectly still in what his species would recognize as intense concentration. "But surely their commanders operate with more tactical wisdom," suggested Cadet Fendrax, the neural collective's components clustering anxiously. "These must be aberrations, not doctrine." "Let's examine their command structures," Veelan replied, shifting the hologram once more. What followed was footage of human officers leading from the front, sharing the same dangers as their subordinates. Communications showing commanders refusing to abandon positions despite overwhelming odds. Historical recordings of human leaders giving speeches that invoked emotional rather than logical responses, calls to sacrifice, to endure, to overcome. "This makes no sense," whispered Cadet Rixel, her earlier disdain replaced by confusion. "Their biological imperative should be survival, not this." As the first part of Veelan's presentation concluded, the cadets' initial mockery had transformed into an uncomfortable silence. Many were taking notes with unusual intensity, while others sat motionless, their species-specific signs of distress becoming increasingly evident. And they had only just begun. "We'll now examine human adaptability in combat situations," Professor Veelan announced, seemingly oblivious to the growing discomfort in the theater. The hologram shifted to footage of human soldiers fashioning weapons from found materials, explosive devices made from agricultural fertilizer, traps constructed from household items, vehicles retrofitted with armor plating and mounted weapons. "Humans call this improvisation," Veelan explained. "When denied access to traditional military equipment, they demonstrate remarkable creativity in weaponizing their environment." Cadet Lorvik's crystalline form had developed visible stress fractures. "Professor, are you suggesting these primates could pose a threat to Confederation forces? Because this seems increasingly." His question was interrupted by a retching sound. Cadet Marine's containment suit had begun to cloud with distress biochemicals. The footage had shifted to show aftermath scenes, human settlements destroyed by warfare, civilian casualties, medical personnel treating horrific injuries. Atmospheric adjusters to maximum. Commander Trelox ordered as several other cadets began showing signs of physiological distress. The theater's environmental systems hummed louder as they worked to compensate for the various biochemical responses being triggered among the diverse species of cadets. Professor Veelan paused the presentation. "Is there a problem, cadets?" "With all due respect, Professor," Cadet Fendrax's neural collective voice trembled slightly, components vibrating with agitation. You're showing us sentient beings deliberately causing extreme suffering to other sentient beings. Even in our most severe conflicts, the Confederation has never. That's precisely the point, Veelan interrupted, her form darkening to deep purple. Humans don't fight like we do. They don't view warfare as an extension of politics or resource allocation. For them, it's existential, personal, and often emotional. It's barbaric, exclaimed another cadet, a methane breather whose respiratory apparatus was working overtime. Perhaps, Veelan acknowledged, but effectiveness in combat isn't always correlated with what we consider civilized behavior. Commander Trelock stood up. Professor, perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow the cadets to. No, Veelan's form pulsed firmly. They need to see this. Especially what comes next. The hologram shifted again, now showing footage of human special forces operations. Small teams infiltrating hostile territory, operating independently for extended periods, completing missions despite losing communication with command structures. Humans call these their elite warriors, Veelan explained. Note how they continue functioning effectively despite physical exhaustion, environmental extremes, and psychological stress that would incapacitate most Confederation species. One cadet suddenly stood up, appendages trembling. This isn't warfare. This is madness. They're killing their own species with enthusiasm. Not enthusiasm, Veelan corrected. Determination. There's a difference. Another segment began playing, showing human resilience after devastating attacks. Cities rebuilding after bombardment. Civilian populations enduring rationing, blackouts, and martial law without collapse. Their social structures don't fracture under pressure the way our simulations predict they should, Veelan pointed out. They adapt. They endure. Sometimes they even grow stronger through conflict. The tension in the room had become unbearable. Several cadets were openly displaying signs of severe distress. Others were engaged in heated whispered debates. Commander Trelock kept looking between the cadets and the presentation, his mandibles clicking with increasing agitation. And now, Veelan continued relentlessly, let's examine their concept of total war. The mobilization of their entire civilization toward a single military objective. The hologram showed factories converting to weapons production, civilian populations enlisted into military service, your scientific research directed exclusively toward combat applications. Their historical records indicate they can transition from peace to full war mobilization in less than a standard solar rotation, Veelan noted. No other known species demonstrates this rapid adaptation capability. That was the breaking point. Cadet Marine's containment suit couldn't process her biochemical distress quickly enough. It ruptured with a wet pop, releasing a cloud of noxious gas. Several other cadets began experiencing their species' equivalent of panic responses. A crystalline cadet shattered his seating apparatus. A methane breather's respiratory system went into emergency shutdown. Enough. Commander Trelock bellowed, activating the emergency lighting. This session is suspended. Medical teams to the tactical analysis theater immediately. As emergency responders rushed in, Professor Veelan calmly deactivated the holographic projector. If anyone had been watching her closely, they might have noticed her form briefly pulse with a color that in her species indicated satisfaction. 3 cycles later, Commander Trelock stared at the stack of digital resignation forms on his desk. Nearly half the senior cadet class had formally requested withdrawal from the academy. Each form cited philosophical reconsideration of military service, or incompatibility with combat psychology requirements. His communication panel chimed. Professor Veelan requests entry, announced the automated system. Granted, Trelock growled. Veelan glided in, her form displaying the neutral professional colors appropriate for a faculty meeting. If she noticed the commander's agitation, she gave no indication. You've created quite the situation, Professor, Trelock said, gesturing to the resignation forms. Half my senior class is abandoning their military careers because your presentation triggered species-wide trauma responses. I understand that's one interpretation of events, Veelan replied calmly. What other interpretation could there possibly be? Trelox's mandibles clicked rapidly in frustration. The psychiatric division has been working non-stop since your presentation. 3 cadets have been diagnosed with acute stress disorders. 2 others have requested memory suppression therapy. The Galactic Education Commissioner has contacted me personally. All expected outcomes. Veelan's form pulsed briefly with purple satisfaction before returning to professional neutrality. Trelox froze. Expected? You anticipated this response? Of course, Veelan moved closer to his desk. Commander, what is the purpose of this academy? To train the Confederation's military leadership, he replied automatically. No, the purpose is to identify those suited for military leadership and separate them from those who are not, Veelan corrected. Those cadets who resigned? They've just learned something crucial about themselves before being placed in command positions where that self-knowledge would come at a much higher price. Trelox's angular head tilted slightly as the implication sank in. This was a psychological screening exercise? In part, Veelan acknowledged. But also a necessary education. Those who remained who processed the psychological shock and still wish to serve now understand something critical about potential adversaries that no simulation could teach them. That some species fight with a ferocity our tactical doctrines don't account for, Trelox said slowly, beginning to understand. Precisely. The cadets who resigned, they would have frozen in actual combat against such an enemy. Those who stayed have begun asking the right questions. They're revising their tactical assumptions. They're growing as officers. The commander was silent for a long moment, his compound eyes fixed on the resignation forms. The Education Commissioner won't be satisfied with this explanation. Perhaps not, Veelan agreed. But the Military Strategic Command will be. In fact, her form rippled with subtle colors of amusement. They approved this curriculum specifically. What? Trelox's mandibles clacked in surprise. Commander, did you really think I would present such controversial material without authorization from the highest levels? Veelan's form briefly displayed the pattern of a senior academic pulling rank. The Strategic Command has been concerned about our officer preparation protocols for some time. They wanted a more effective screening mechanism. And I wasn't informed because your genuine reaction was part of the test environment, Veelan explained. Your shock reinforced the cadets' own responses. Had you known, your pheromonal signals might have prepared them. Commander Trelox sat back in his support structure, his exoskeleton creaking slightly. He was simultaneously outraged at being kept in the dark and reluctantly impressed by the thoroughness of the strategy. So what happens now? He finally asked. Now, Veelan replied, we continue the education of those cadets who remained with a new appreciation for the complexity of interspecies conflict. And we reclassify several previously primitive species in our threat assessment matrices. The Galactic Confederation Strategic Command Chamber was silent as the final report from the Academy experiment was presented. Admiral Zorthex, whose ancient crustacean form had witnessed 3 centuries of galactic politics, finally spoke. So Professor Veelan's assessment is verified. Humans represent a unique tactical challenge despite their technological limitations. The evidence appears conclusive, confirmed General Pirith, whose energy-based form flickered with concern. Their psychological approach to warfare doesn't align with any of our existing combat doctrines. More concerning, added Security Director Mulvin, is their adaptability. Our standard approach to technologically inferior species involves containing their advancement. But humans, they demonstrate remarkable leaps in military technology during active conflicts. The holographic display in the center of the chamber showed a rotating Earth, surrounded by data points about human military capabilities, psychological profiles, and historical conflict patterns. Their entire cultural development has been shaped by intraspecies warfare, observed Science Counselor Drexa. They've spent more of their recorded history fighting themselves than at peace. It's produced a species uniquely comfortable with violence and destruction. Admiral Zorthex's appendages tapped a complicated rhythm on the table, a sign of deep thought in his species. Recommendations? Reclassification of Sol 3 as a Type 4 restricted engagement zone. Security Director Mulvin replied immediately. Diplomatic contact only through proxies. No direct military engagement under any circumstances without full strategic command authorization. That's unprecedented for a pre-interstellar species, objected one of the junior commanders. So is their combat psychology, countered Mulvin. Our models suggest that conventional military pressure would only accelerate their technological development and unify their fractious political structures. The projected casualty rates in such a scenario are unacceptable. I concur, rumbled Admiral Zorthex. Motion to reclassify Earth as do not engage territory. All in favor? The vote was unanimous. Meanwhile, back at the Academy, Professor Veelan was conducting the final session of her revised curriculum. The remaining cadets, those who hadn't resigned or requested transfers, were engaged in a spirited tactical discussion. But if we can't rely on technological superiority against such species, what becomes our strategic advantage? Asked Cadet Fendrax, whose neural collective had reorganized into a more resilient configuration since the initial presentation. Understanding, Veelan replied simply, her form glowing with the warm colors of an educator seeing real comprehension dawn. We now understand them better than they understand us or even themselves. That is always the supreme tactical advantage. As the session concluded, Commander Trelox approached Veelan in the corridor outside. The Strategic Command's decision came through, he informed her quietly. Earth has been reclassified. No military engagement permitted. A wise decision, Veelan's form rippled with approval. There's a certain irony, Trelox noted. These humans have no idea that their own historical records have rendered them effectively untouchable by the most powerful military force in the galaxy. The greatest irony, Veelan replied, colors shifting to academic amusement, is that they continue to fear alien invasion in their popular entertainment. They create elaborate fictions about defending their world from technologically superior species, little realizing that any species advanced enough to reach them would be wise enough not to engage, Veelan finished his thought, at least not militarily. And our cadets will make better officers for understanding that technology alone doesn't determine military outcomes, Veelan said. Some of them have already proposed fascinating revisions to our standard combat doctrines. As they parted ways, Veelan allowed herself a private moment of satisfaction. Her research on humans would continue, of course. Such a fascinating species deserved ongoing study. But from a very, very safe distance. On Earth, a military history professor concluded her lecture on ancient warfare techniques at West Point. Remember, cadets, she said to the room full of young officers in training, throughout history, technological superiority has often been overcome by determination, adaptability, and sheer human stubbornness. The cadets nodded, absorbing the lesson without ever suspecting that across the galaxy, an advanced civilization had just reached the exact same conclusion and had decided to give humanity a very wide berth as a result. Humanity would continue developing, fighting its internal conflicts, and looking to the stars with both hope and apprehension, blissfully unaware that they had already won their first interstellar war without firing a single shot.